My job is to introduce the speaker who has come to you from New York, as you've heard, and he's going to help kind of situate the day for us, talk to us about some big issues in education, things for us to think about when you're in all your workshops throughout the day. We are very, very proud to have Pedro Noguera with us today. He is a professor from the Steinhardt School of Education at New York University. He's the executive director of the Metropolitan Center for Urban Education, and he's obviously a very busy person, an overachiever perhaps, and the co-director of the Institute for the Study of Globalization and Education in Metropolitan Settings. And one of the things we're most interested in is he is the founder, one of the founders and co-chair of an amazing initiative that's happening in the United States to develop a broader, bolder approach to education, which I'm sure he will tell you about. He has been a professor at the graduate schools of both Harvard and the University of California, Berkeley. He's the author and editor of many books and many, many articles, and he was a part-time high school teacher and a regular guest on CNN and NPR. So this is a man who likes to talk about education, cares about education, and knows a lot. So, ladies and gentlemen, Pedro Noguera.
Good morning. It is a real pleasure to be here in Toronto with you and to be asked to serve as the keynote speaker for the People of Education Conference. And I could tell from listening to the introductions that these are leaders in the room and people who are actively doing what you can where you live to try to create the schools our children deserve. So I'm excited to be with you. Not my first trip to Canada. Been here many times over the years, including Toronto. And so I feel very closely connected to you. I often say that when I'm not here, I speak very highly of Canada and what we could learn from emulating you, which Americans don't take very seriously because many of them don't even think of Canada as a country. They think of Canada as a territory of the United States, kind of like Hawaii or Puerto Rico. And the idea that we could learn from Canada seems a bit preposterous, but I would say, no, they've got healthcare already, and they even figure out how to enroll people in it. They found ways to keep higher education affordable and accessible to large numbers of people. We could certainly learn from that. And let's remember that when slavery was still very much in place in the United States, Canada was a place people escaped to. And so all of those, I think, are good reasons to feel good about Canada. However, the Canadians like to remind me, we're not as good as you think. And they point out that we have our own flaws, our own challenges, our own issues. And so even before coming, I was sent documents and papers about your challenges here in Canada. And so I know very well that the disparities that we are trying to address in the United States are very much a part of Canada as well. Disparities not only in educational outcomes, but in health, in employment, in income, in quality of life. And all of that suggests that we are not yet the kind of equitable, just societies we might aspire to become. And so I would encourage you, even as you think about the importance of education, to keep in mind that the reason why we are People for Education is because we understand that education is the pathway to a more just, more democratic society. That's really the goal here. We know that education is implicated in all of the problems facing our countries, whether those problems be poverty, racism, inequality, drug use, crime. We can go down the list. You peel back the layers, you start to understand lack of education or miseducation is right there at the crux of part of what's wrong here. And we also know the converse is true as well. That is that by changing education, by providing a better quality of education to a greater number of people, we might in fact be able to solve some of those problems. And so that raises the question then, what are we doing wrong? Why isn't the education that we presently provide to our children enabling us to create the kind of society we all would hope to live in? And so today I want to spend some time with you looking closely at what we've been doing. because although you're doing a better job than we are in the United States in many, many fronts, you still have your challenges. And your challenges come from the fact that in too many cases, the schools we've created reproduce the existing patterns of inequality that we have in our society. That is the strongest predictor for how well a child will do in school, for how well they'll do in university, or whether or not they'll get into university, and ultimately even what kinds of jobs they will hold is who their parents were and how much money that family earned and how much education the parents had, and particularly the education of the mother, because more often than not, the mother is the child's first teacher. And to the degree that these patterns remain intact, we have a tremendous problem, because what they suggest is that rather than education being a resource for equity, it is actually the engine of inequity and the means through which inequity perpetuates itself. And anyone who is an educator, anyone who is a board member, anyone who believes and understands the importance of education must be deeply disturbed by this reality. It's an indictment of what we do. And so we have to ask ourselves, what's wrong with what we've been doing? How could it be that those who need the least help are often those who get the least in our schools? Why aren't our schools making more of a difference? And the simple fact is that we've got to judge ourselves in that way, because if we don't, if we stay content with being able to serve well those who already have the most privileges, then we become content with a society that's premised on hierarchy, a society that's premised on injustice. So again, the kinds of schools we have will determine the kind of nation we live in. And if we hope to live in a nation where a child's race or class or ethnicity or religion or language or culture does not predict or determine what they will be able to do, then we need to create schools that would allow for that. And if you think about your schools right now and ask yourself, who are the children that are thriving? Who are the children that are excelling? And you don't see the distribution of children in Canada in that profile, then we have a problem in your school as well. And we know that that's a problem that we simply can't wish away. We've got to spend time really understanding why it is that the term you use here in Canada, the visible minorities, or only 16% of your population, seem to cling to the bottom of the hierarchy. And why these patterns are so intractable. Canada, unfortunately, has pursued a set of strategies that resemble the United States, and I think Ontario in particular has gone down this path. And not surprisingly, the policies have perpetuated these cycles rather than breaking them, even though they were created to do the opposite. So we have to ask why. And I don't want to suggest that we've done this because the people responsible are somehow evil or conspiring to keep children down. I would say they hope to do the opposite. In the United States, at least, we have great slogans for our policies, like "No Child Left Behind." But I often point out to people that that slogan did not come from the Bush administration. It came from the Children's Defense Fund. And when the Children's Defense Fund and Marian Wright Edelman came up with the slogan, "Leave no child behind," they didn't mean we should test the children as frequently as possible. They had something else in mind, like child welfare and well-being, and ensuring that the needs of children were being met. But in the United States, that's not part of the law. Instead, what we have is what I would argue is a narrow vision of what constitutes a good education for children. And that narrow vision is exactly what this policy initiative that I'm a part of, this broader, bolder approach, is trying to challenge. And I would argue that to the degree this resonates with what you're dealing with here in Canada, then you also need to think about a broader approach here. The narrow approach would lead us to believe that it is pressure and humiliation that will lead to improvement in schools. We'll let people know which schools are failing. We'll advertise it in the paper so you will know this is a failing school based on the results of the children. The narrow approach will focus narrowly on achievement as measured by test scores, overlooking all the other things that we know are important in education, like whether or not a child can read well, can they write well, can they do research independently, are they ready to participate in our democracy and vote in an election, are they ready to serve on a jury if need be. Because ultimately, we're trying to prepare children for adulthood, to participate in democracy. And if they get high test scores, but really can't make sense of the world around them, we have still failed. And if they get high test scores and get strung out on drugs, we fail too. Education is always about more than simply how well you did on a test. And to the degree that we allow that to be lost, we lose something very, very important in education. The narrow view would have us to believe that ranking children, ranking schools is actually a strategy. That would be like going to your doctor and your doctor telling you, yes, you're very sick. Say, okay, doctor, what's next? Say, that's what I do here, I rank you. You are very sick compared to most people. But what's next? No, you go to another doctor for that. I just rank, I measure. Right? Ranking and measuring is not a strategy. It may be a tool if we use it that way, but I would argue we're not using it that way in most places. And when we have that narrow view, then we say the way to address the problem is to script what teachers do with children, give them highly prescriptive lesson plans and curricula to use, because we need to create schools that are teacher-proof, because they can't be trusted. And the narrow view would want us to hold principals accountable and the other leaders accountable so that we can blame them, as if, again, blame was a strategy for improvement. The narrow view wants us to treat parents as consumers. In the United States, we tell parents, if you don't like the school, go somewhere else, as if that is an option. I know in rural Canada, that's certainly not an option, is it? And the narrow view would have us use a punitive approach to discipline, where we would weed out the bad children, who almost always are the children from the most disadvantaged families. And finally, the narrow view thinks that competition among schools is the way that schools will improve, because we're using a market strategy for school reform, which means there will be winners and losers. We've been arguing that we need a different view, a different approach, a broader approach to improving schools. And that approach needs to first and foremost focus on the conditions of learning and ask whether or not we've created the conditions in schools that are conducive to good teaching and learning. I'll come back to that in a moment, because I would argue that if we spent more time looking at conditions than outcomes, we would be in a better position to actually help schools to meet the needs of children. Broad view says we should be using assessment to diagnose learning needs, not merely to rank children, which means that the results from those assessments need to get back to teachers in a timely manner so that the teachers know how to respond to the assessment to give children more of what they need. Sounds logical, doesn't it? Except that often what's logical is not what's happening in education. Broad view says we've got to develop teachers' skills on an ongoing basis. It's not something you do in grad school and stop. It is, to be a teacher is to be a lifelong learner, because it's a craft that's combined with art and skill. And because the needs of our children are constantly changing and who we serve is constantly changing, if teachers are not learners themselves, their ability to meet the needs of a changing society will be limited. And so we need to ensure that that's occurring. Broad view says we need to focus on the whole child and recognize that development, child development, rooted in understanding of their physical, their emotional, the psychological development, has to be how we guide our policies. Abraham Maslow reminded us there is a hierarchy of human needs, and invariably the children whose basic needs are not being met, the need for safety, for shelter, for good nutrition, for love, are children that will not experience healthy human development. And over when I go to schools, it's very clear that the children we're not serving are the children with the greatest needs. What are we doing to respond to those needs? The broad approach says we need strategies to address them. We need to not just hold the leaders and the teachers accountable, we need to hold everyone accountable. The students themselves have to be accountable, because if the students are not invested as learners, it's a critical part of the process. It's not going to work. And if the parents are not accountable, if the community is not accountable for what's happening in schools, we're not going to get the schools we need and deserve. And so we need to broaden how we think about accountability and really focus on responsibility rather than accountability, which often is framed in more punitive terms. It says we need to treat parents as partners in the process. Because we all know that what parents do at home matters, and what ultimately is most important is getting parents to reinforce the importance of education at home, which means we have to acknowledge and understand that all parents, regardless of how much money or education they've had, can do a lot to help their children, and are more likely to if they're treated with respect and empathy. And if schools understand that engaging their parents as partners is central to their work of changing outcomes for the children. Broad view says we need to use discipline to develop character, which means we've got to focus on the factors that are contributing to the problems, so we don't just react to the symptoms. And then we've got to keep children connected to learning, because the hardest children to discipline are the children who no longer care, the children who've given up. And keeping kids connected to school and addressing those underlying issues results in children who become self-disciplined, which is ultimately what we should be striving for in schools. And the broad view says we need to expand learning opportunities and look at the gaps in learning opportunities after school, summer school, the gaps that middle-class families fill in with their own resources. But poor families typically can't. Homework is an equity issue. True? If you don't have access to an educated parent and a computer at home, you are always at a disadvantage when it comes time to do homework. What are we doing to acknowledge these kinds of built-in disadvantages that set some children apart and make it more difficult for them to excel? And finally, why aren't we promoting more cooperation among schools, learning from success? Why is it so often that even within the same school, you will find one teacher who is extraordinary at what she does? And the children will tell you, I'm learning from that teacher. But there's no conversation with the colleagues about what she's doing. And the expertise is not being shared. And you see that in the same school, and you'll see that across schools. An outlier school where children from diverse backgrounds are thriving, but no other school in the district is learning from that school. They're not visiting. Why aren't we learning from success? We do that in sports, don't we? In football, in hockey. We certainly do, but why we don't do that in education, not nearly enough. And so we miss the opportunity to learn from what could work. Instead, what we're focused on is measuring. And I know Annie and I spent a lot of time yesterday talking about measuring. And I was reminded and pointed out that you've used that in a powerful way to draw attention to inequities. So I don't want to discourage that. Measuring access to libraries and laboratories and other resources is very important in showing those discrepancies. So this is not an argument against measurement, but it is a reminder. And I'm using a quote some attribute to Einstein, others say it was actually William Cameron, a sociologist from England, who first said it. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. Let's be skeptical of how we're using these test scores to make judgments about children, because many of us have seen children who we know have strong skills but do not perform well on tests. We know that they can write well, we know that they can speak well, but the test is not revealing it. The tests are only an indicator of what a child may be able to do, but we need other indicators What does their writing actually show? Authentic assessments of learning, so critical to knowing whether or not what we're doing is actually working, is actually meeting student needs. So I encourage you, even as this is not an argument against testing, but it is a call for having a broader set of evaluation strategies that we draw upon. Because if we don't do that, invariably, I'm afraid that Canada may one day follow the United States and begin using testing as a weapon instead of a tool. The biggest obstacle to doing what we need at the level of the school, now, I can talk, and I have talked already about the failure of policy, but at the level of the school, the biggest obstacle to meeting the needs of all children is what I describe as the normalization of failure. The complacency that sets in within a school when you grow accustomed to seeing certain children not achieving, certain children not thriving, certain children acting out. Invariably, over time, you begin to rationalize that and say, well, look at the families they come from. Look at the home. I had the brother. He was just like that. How many of you have heard that conversation in a school? And here's what we know. Whenever you go to a school where that is the narrative about why children are not performing, you can be sure that that school will never improve. Because instead of taking responsibility for what they do control, they're pointing fingers at what they don't control. And in pointing fingers, they're losing the opportunity to build the relationships that are so critical to changing outcomes for children. What's the conversation like in your schools about who you're serving? Is it about blame or is it about responsibility? The most basic question that every school, that every educator has to be able to answer in order to meet the needs of its children is, what does it take to educate the children we serve? I want you to think about that question, because it sounds like a very simple question, doesn't it? But in order to answer it, you have to know something about the children you serve. And if the only thing you know about them is what their deficits are, then you don't really know them. Because if you don't know how they problem solve, how they use language, how they learn. How does a child learn to cook? How does a child learn to fix a car? How come it's true that the average middle school student, especially a middle school boy, knows more technology than about technology than the average teacher? You get a new smartphone, what do you have to do? You give it to a child. Show me how to use this thing. And they will download apps you didn't know existed, right? Some people are still learning what an app is. How do your children learn? What interests them? What excites them? What motivates them? If you don't know about who you serve, there's very little chance you'll know how to serve them. And the biggest obstacle to knowing how to serve them is the stereotypes about who we think they are. Stereotypes that are informed by racial bias, by cultural bias, by the disconnects that exist in our society. The fragmentation. In Canada, yes, you are much better than the United States, but Canada is still a society that is segregated, if not by law, but just by everyday life. Ask yourself in your own circles, how many of my friends, how many of the people that I socialize with on a regular basis are from a different background? And if the answer is very few, then that suggests that when you're in a situation where you have to deal with children and families from a different background, you may be unsure of how to manage that interaction, unsure of how to become an ally to that student, to that family. And the first step in becoming better as educators and becoming better able to serve the needs of those who are not well served now is to acknowledge what we don't know and what we need to know to do this work well. So I want to encourage you to challenge and ask yourself, what are our beliefs about children who are not being served well? What's the prevailing attitude and the atmosphere within our schools about this work? There's good research out there about what it takes for schools to improve. Again, the remarkable thing is that research often does not inform policy. was an exhaustive study done on the Chicago public schools by Anthony Bright and his colleagues at the University of Chicago a few years ago. And the question was, why did certain schools over a 10-year period get better and other schools not get better? And the period in question was the period when Arne Duncan, the current Secretary of Education of the United States, was the superintendent of schools, or the CEO as they call it, in Chicago. They like those business titles now over schools, CEO. And what the study found was that there were 5 essential ingredients that must be in place for schools to experience sustained improvement over time. All 5, not 4 out of 5, certainly not 3 out of 5. All 5 have to be there. And when you look at the list, you'll say, wow, that doesn't sound unusual. It sounded like we should have known that already. But yes, there's got to be a coherent strategy for how to deliver instruction. What does that mean? It means that every teacher's not doing their own thing. It means that they come together on a shared approach about how to deliver that curriculum. And there's in place an ongoing strategy to develop their capacity to meet the student needs. So if you're serving English language learners, then everyone on the staff is learning how to work with children who are learning English for the first time. Or if you're serving children with large numbers of disabilities, then everyone on the staff, not just the special education teachers, become more skilled at how to work with children who have different types of learning disabilities. And there are strong parent-community ties. Again, because the research has told us for years that the learning at home matters, and that when parents hold schools accountable, right? I often remind people, when you go into an affluent community, who's holding the schools accountable? It's not the district leadership, it's the parents, right? Why? Because those parents feel entitled. Those parents come in and ask questions. Those parents insist that their children get the education they believe they deserve. And if they're not satisfied, they don't just accept it. They go above your head, don't they? And they raise a ruckus. Yes, you know those parents, right? Well, what would happen if all our parents behaved that way? If there was a genuine effort to make sure that the parents of the most disadvantaged were keenly aware of their rights and keenly aware of what a good education consisted of, so that they could demand it. Research shows that these high-performing schools, or these schools that experience improvement, have a climate and a culture conducive to learning. What does that mean? It means that the values, the norms of the school are all reinforcing the importance of learning. It means the school is a place where it's cool to be smart. Think about that. Ask your kids now, is it cool to be smart at this school? Is the peer culture aligned with what we're trying to do? If it's not, then something is wrong with the school. And that can't be fixed merely by putting more pressure on the school. Because cultures can't be imposed on schools. Cultures have to develop from within. And they require buy-in amongst the staff, and eventually buy-in from the children and their families. Because a culture is rooted in shared practices, shared understanding of how things will be done. Generic schools serving high-need children never get the job done. Schools where people just work because they do their job to get a check will never get the job done. Because it's too hard. It's too hard. Let's all keep this in mind. The need to create equitable schools is hard. It's hard because all the other pressures in our society are towards inequity. So we're working upstream. Right? And when you work upstream, you have to do it together. This is not just about the Herculean efforts of a few individual teachers. This is about communities of educators coming together with parents, with children, to accomplish something greater. That's what it takes to create a culture that affirms the importance of learning. And I'll describe some schools that are doing that right now. And in all of these schools that have made sustained efforts to improve change, there's leadership in place. Leadership that has the vision, that reminds people of why we're doing it. Leadership that provides the support, the guidance. Leadership that engages community. And leadership is, I would say, the critical ingredient that again, can't be done without, because when you don't have strong leadership, then you don't have the means to guide a school and keep people connected and ensure that morale among the staff is high. I've never been to a high-performing school where people don't work hard. Never been to one. And I've never seen a contract written that will make people work hard. This is not about the contract. It's about something else. How do you get teachers to, on their own, make that call to the parent at night? On their own, come in on a Saturday to make sure the classroom looks great. On their own, to do that extra tutoring that the child needs. And not ask whether or not I'm going to be paid for it, but just know that this is part of what it's going to take. The high-performing schools are doing this right now. They're doing it. And no one is telling them to do it. They're doing it because of that shared mission. And I would encourage you to ask, what are we doing to make sure that mission, that vision, is in place at a greater number of our schools? It's a vision that's holistic. Holistic because our children are whole beings. You can't separate the academic needs from the physical needs, from the emotional needs, from the psychological needs. They all come in the same package. The big problem with our relentless focus on test scores has been that we started to ignore child development and ignore those other needs. And yes, you have a healthcare system, but what about the emotional health of your children? What about the psychological well-being of your children? What are you doing to ensure that all children have some adult in their life who knows, I have your back? I'm the person that will always be there for you. Because if that child does not have such a person at home, then they're going to need such a person in school. We need a bigger vision, a vision that is focused on teaching and learning and recognizes that teaching and learning are connected activities. Right? Which means that if the children are not learning, it means that we're not teaching very well. Because teaching and talking are not the same. And teaching is much more than covering the material. And when we teach with a focus on learning, when we teach with a focus on evidence that our children are understanding and comprehending what it is that's important, we teach differently. And we recognize that talking louder is not an intervention. Right? That if they don't get it the first time, we have to have a repertoire of skills that we can turn to teach it differently, if need be. And that we do our best work when we work collaboratively with our colleagues and problem solve together about how to reach different learners. Because this is, again, not about one teacher trying to figure it all out by herself. But this broader vision has to include opportunities to extend learning for children who we know need more, who we know are not getting the support at home that they need. It has to include a focus on safety. And not just safety in school, but safety to and from school, safety in the neighborhood, safety on the internet, because we know that a lot of the bullying today is occurring on the internet. And we also know that the quality of the relationships between the adult and the child will ultimately determine whether or not our schools are safe, because if something is occurring, either on the internet or in the streets, and we have a strong relationship with the child, they will let us know. But the relationship's not there, the child will think they have to figure it out on their own. So relationships are ultimately the most important form of security there is. We know that we need partners to do this work, particularly when we're working with communities that are new to this community, new to Canada. New immigrants often don't trust the schools, don't know the schools, don't understand how it works. And so who are the organizations that do know that community? Might be nonprofits or NGOs or churches or other groups that we need to partner with if we're going to extend ourselves effectively. And so we need to think in broad terms and have that guide our vision and constantly ask ourselves, are we meeting the needs of our children? Are our schools organized to address these needs? There are a few basic things we know, and we need to make sure that it's reflected in our practice and reflected in our policies. We know that achievement is affected by a variety of factors: the social, the psychological, the environmental. We've got to have schools that can address those and strategies to address those. We know that services must be provided in a coordinated manner so that we don't allow children to slip through the cracks, and that crucial information is being shared between service providers and educators so they understand what a child may be going through. I was talking to a group of teachers the other day. They said they had a child who, despite displaying great potential in class, continued to fail on every test. Child in foster care. This went on for 3 years until she got into a stable home, and then she soared. They had no idea what kind of home she was going to every day when she left school. But it clearly was a home that was causing distress, and children in emotional distress tend not to do so well academically. So we need to make sure we know about who we serve, and we need to make sure that art and music and sports are all part of the curriculum, because even though they may not be something you can measure in terms of the value, we do know that when we address the aesthetics, when we address the physical needs of our children, that our children are more likely to be engaged, more likely to be excited about coming to school. And we can never allow this relentless focus on testing to take that away from our children. In the United States, I'm seeing schools where music's out of the curriculum because it's not on the tests. Art is taken away because they've got double period math, double period literacy. Recess taken away, the recess taken away. Why? Not on the test. So I studied the other day and said that eating lunch was good for test scores, and I said, thank God. Thank God they might take lunch too. Our children need to eat lunch, they need recess, they need art, they need music, they need a well-rounded education. So there are some key principles that have got to be in place in this work. First of all, we've got to recognize that poverty is not a learning disability. Let's be very clear about that. Poverty does not prevent a child from learning. However, poverty ignored can be disabling. When we ignore the needs, when we ignore the challenges that children face from poverty, that can, in fact, result in a child who's not able to thrive in school. Education could play a role in breaking the cycle of poverty, but only if it's an education that empowers. I'll show you in a moment what that looks like at a classroom level and what it looks like at a school level. But to be empowered, it means that you've got to know that knowledge is power. You've got to know that through education, you have the ability to transform your life. Right? And it's when education does that that we see patterns begin to change, and schools no longer merely reproduce inequality. And this has got to be an education that promotes excellence and clearly encourages mastery rather than passing. Right? That teaches our children to aim for the very best in themselves by modeling and demonstrating what the very best looks like. Because when we don't do that, we see children settling to merely get through because they've not been exposed to excellence. And lastly, the schools have to be organized to meet the needs of their students. And this sounds, again, obvious, but I would say all you have to do is look at the schools that are not performing well, and they are clearly not organized to meet the needs of their children. They're organized for another purpose, but not to meet the needs of the children they serve. So what does it look like when that's happening? Well, it looks like this school here in the Bronx Academy of Language and Technology. Now, what you know is all of the children at this school, 100% of these children come from families at or below the poverty level. All of them are recent immigrants. Most of them came to this country not having attended school regularly in their native country, the Dominican Republic. That means they are illiterate in Spanish. They speak Spanish, but they are not literate in Spanish. And everyone who knows about language acquisition knows you use the native language to acquire the second language, to acquire English. Very hard to acquire English if you're illiterate in your native language. Well, at this school, they've been organized to meet the needs of the students. So this school has a 98% graduation rate. And although 40% of the students at this school are undocumented, meaning in the country illegally, which means they can't go to college because they don't have Social Security numbers, The school is focused on getting them into jobs into technology because they know that those jobs are there and those jobs are high paying. So they have partnerships with technology companies and with community colleges so that these children, despite the legal challenges they face, have access. It's a school that's organized to meet their needs. So all the teachers meet on a regular basis to plan their lessons together and then critique each other's lessons and give each other's feedback. Say, no, that's not going to work. Because they know that they can't just leave it to a few teachers to teach English because every teacher's got to be involved in teaching English, whether you're teaching math or science or art. It's a school that the children say feels like a family, feels like community. Safety from community, safety from knowing that everyone there cares about you. The school that beats the odds because in New York City, children of this profile have the highest dropout rates of any group in the city. Any group of the city. Now, I would think that if I was at one of those other schools, I'd be trying to get to the school to see what are they doing differently. How come it works there? Doesn't happen. They're up there on the 4th floor of this very old high school, succeeding, but no one even goes to visit, except for me occasionally. And because of the partnership we've established, now we have established, these are children who live in the Bronx but have never, they don't even know that New York University exists because they're cut off. But I have a colleague who was a chemistry professor. He said, I'll open up my lab to some of those students who want to be scientists. And now we have an internship, so kids who want to study science come to NYU and are in the chemistry lab doing internships. And now another professor now who was in engineering doing the same thing. Because we know that a big part of changing outcomes is expanding their horizons about what's possible. This is Hollenbeck Middle School in Los Angeles. Take a look at that classroom. It's a math class. Look at the children. They're actively involved in learning. The children are in control. This teacher is so good, she can stop to talk to me because she doesn't have to monitor and hover over her children because the children know exactly what they need to do. They're working together. You don't see one child sitting down copying notes from the other. They're all aware of their roles. Because in addition to learning the math, they're also learning how to work together. Right? What we call social intelligence now. They're learning how to deal with disagreements when they arise, because invariably they do, right? Anybody who's worked with other people knows. Sometimes you have an argument. Sometimes you disagree, and so they're getting the emotional skills for managing their disagreements. Which means that you're watching at work a master teacher. Because she has taught these children how to do that, how to be in control. And now she can become the facilitator. We talk about differentiated instruction. I'm sure that's a term you use now in Canada too. Well, differentiation is only possible if you could do this. If you're trying to talk at them all at once, can't differentiate unless you can talk out the two sides of your mouth at the same time. Now, some teachers look at a picture like that and they get scared. They get scared because all they can imagine is chaos. Right? After a few minutes, that the children will begin throwing things or become distracted and disengaged, but not this teacher, because she's taught these children how to take responsibility for the learning so that when the bell rings, they're actually surprised. They're interrupted because they've been so engrossed, so immersed in the learning. And these children are lucky, because they come from a neighborhood in East Los Angeles that's right across the street from Garfield High School. And Garfield High School is where Jaime Escalante was the teacher. Right? Jaime Escalante was this crazy Uruguayan, well, actually Bolivian, engineer who decided to teach math. And when he went to Garfield, he decided what he wanted to do was to teach calculus. And he said, what we've got to do is raise the bar and offer advanced placement calculus. That's the calculus course that allows you to get college credit when you get to the university. And the first people to oppose him were his colleagues who said, our kids can't do that. Not these kids, because we serve the children of custodians and factory workers. That's who we serve in this school. He says, your goals are your expectations too low. Watch me. And so Escalante, over 20 years, taught advanced placement calculus, and his kids did so well that the educational testing service that administers the advanced placement exam came in to investigate them because they thought they were cheating. So they required that they retest the children. And lo and behold, they got retested. They still did well. So after that, the researchers wanted to come in and say, what is this Escalante doing? He must have some magic trick, something going on. And they sent them in from Berkeley, from Stanford, from MIT, and they all came away saying the same thing. They said, we don't see anything so special. Nothing extraordinary about his methods. Because they didn't understand what he called ganas. Ganas is the hunger to learn. That's what he was giving these children. The hunger to learn. He got them to work hard. He got them to come in on Saturdays. He got these kids to believe. He said, you are the descendants of people who built pyramids. Calculus is in your heritage. And then he took them to aeronautical labs. He said, this is where you use calculus. This is why you need to learn it, because you need to expand your sense of what's possible. He died 3 years ago. And when he died, there was this amazing outpouring of engineers and doctors and lawyers and judges who had all been his former students. And all said the same thing: one teacher changed my life. And I met a woman who was a superintendent of a school district in Los Angeles who said she was one of his students. And she was describing to me the way he affected her. She said, he used to come to my soccer games. I said, he came to your soccer games? He said, but not to cheer me on. He would criticize me. He would say, you can't play. Go back to the math. You have no chance in soccer. And eventually he convinced me to go back to the math. The point being that at this school and at the school they'll go to, there have been teachers who've been able to forge relationships with children that are so strong, it makes it possible for those children to break the cycle of poverty. That's what these schools show us and remind us is possible, because, again, these schools exist. These are schools where teachers make expectations clear, they make standards explicit, they expose children to what high-quality work looks like, and they don't settle. They understand that grading is not teaching. The real teaching occurs in the revision, in doing it over, in getting it right, and understanding what right looks like. These are teachers that use assessment as a diagnostic tool and are constantly asking, do you understand? What don't you understand? Because they want their children to be active learners, not passive learners. They're focused on engagement. And they learn about who their students are, so they build a connection between what they teach and what their children already know. And they analyze the work of their students for insights into how they can improve their teaching. Because ultimately, it is what our children can do in our classroom that is the most important assessment that's occurring each and every day. And these are schools that respond in a holistic manner to children. They address the health and welfare needs, the social and emotional needs, the developmental challenges, and they manage to create an environment where children can thrive. Not achieve, but thrive. It's a higher goal. Schools like this one, PS 28 in Brooklyn. Now, we have very fancy names for our schools in New York City. Public School number 28 in Bedford-Stuyvesant. It's a neighborhood that Mike Tyson, the boxer, came from. This was better known for producing boxers and hip-hop artists than it is for producing excellent schools like PS 28. I was invited by Sadie Silver, the principal featured in that news article from the Daily News, whose school got the highest gains in literacy math in Brooklyn. She kept saying, Pedro, come visit my school. So I get to see her school, and when I'm there, I'm greeted by her secretary. And the principal says, I want you to meet the person who does all of the administrative work. She runs the school. I said, well, it's nice to meet you. I said, but now what do you do? She says, I'm the lead teacher. I said, I didn't become a principal to escape the classroom. So let's go. She said, let's go visit some classrooms. And we go to classrooms, and the first thing I see is that in every classroom I'm visiting, there are 4 and 5 adults in the classroom. So I went, where do you get all these teachers from? She said, well, they're not all teachers. So the first thing you should know is we have a push-in special ed program. So all of our special ed teachers work in concert with the teacher. They plan together, so this one is the regular teacher, that one is a special ed teacher. The children don't know the difference. I said, well, who are the others? She said, those are parents we've trained to work with teachers. And they assisted teachers in a variety of roles, and we trained them, and some of them are now in community college studying and hope to become teachers one day because of their exposure here. And I see one parent, she's standing very close to a little boy. She's just standing there while he's working. I said, why is she so close to that little boy? She said, well, she's there to keep him calm. And we are glad she's here today. She explains that 40% of the children in her school are homeless. 40%. That means they're in shelters. It also means they're highly transient because you don't get to stay in the shelter for too long. And you're frequently reassigned to another shelter, and sometimes that means you have to take an extra bus, an extra subway to get to the school. But this school has very low transience rates because the parents know they're getting a good thing. So even if they have to get up at 4 in the morning to get the children there, they do. And because many of her children are in shelters and come from challenging home environments, the school stays open every night till 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock is when the shelter opens. She doesn't want her kids out on the street in the cold. And I said, well, how do you keep the teachers here till 6? She said, my teachers don't have to stay till 6, although many do. So the YMCA runs the second shift at my school. We have a partnership with the YMCA, so there's after-school programs offered. There's art, there's music, there's chess. There are swimming lessons on Thursdays. We have a full range of after-school programs because we know our children need more than can be provided during the typical school day. She has another partnership with the medical school, Downstate Medical School, a few blocks away, so an optometrist comes in once a month, a dentist once a month. Children get their immunizations on site and can get services, including psychological and counseling services, either at the site or at the hospital through this partnership. There are classes for parents who want to get their high school equivalency diploma, classes for parents who want to learn English, job training classes offered by a local economic development organization in the area, because she believes that if parents are educated and employed, they'll do a better job with their children. So I'm very impressed by everything I'm seeing. She said, well, let me show you the professional development I have going on for my teachers today. And we go into a room, there are 8 teachers and 2 social workers. And the focus of the lesson is how to respond to the social and emotional needs of children. And I'm listening to the conversation as teachers pose questions to the social workers. One teacher says, I have a child who's aggressive. He's fighting with other children. Another one says, I have a child with attachment issues. He's attached to my leg and I cannot teach. Another one said, I have a child with anxiety issues. And another one has a child who's depressed. And I'm listening to the conversation, and I'm listening to the practical suggestions being given by the social workers to these teachers, who are then going to go back and try it and come back the next day and say, did it work? Right? I said, what made you decide to offer this as a form of professional development for your teachers? She said, well, until I did, my teachers were referring too many children to special education. And what I realized is that my teachers had to become more skilled to work with this population of children. So this is a part of her ongoing skill development for her teachers. She said, let me take you to meet my guidance counselor. And we get on the horse. She says, before we get there, I have to warn you, I got him from the rubber room. Now, those of you who don't know New York City may never have heard of the rubber room, but the rubber room was a place where a teacher who was written up on an infraction could be sent. And they could be sent there sometimes for years. And they'd sit in this room doing crossword puzzles or yoga, whatever they wanted, and getting paid, but not allowed to interact with children. So I said, how do you get this man from the rubber room? How do you know to get him from the rubber room? She said, well, I don't know why he was there in the first place, but he had been my guidance counselor when I was in school, and he literally saved my life. So when I heard he was there, I said, I want him from my school. And they said, you can have him. So I go in there, and it's an older gentleman who's there with a little boy, about 8 years old, and they're there talking very casually. So I introduced myself, and then I asked the little boy, why are you here today? He said, well, I'm here to learn how to be good. I said, well, is it working? He says, I hope so, because I'm tired of being put out of class all the time. And then I learned this school has a non-suspension policy. They don't believe sending kids home to watch television is an effective form of discipline. Right? They really were focused on how to help this child learn to be good, how to conduct himself in the classroom with others, with his peers and with his teachers. So we're leaving there, and I say, well, I'm really impressed, Sadie, by what you're doing at the school. I'm going to tell the chancellor of New York City, responsible for 1.1 million children in 1,700 schools. She said, well, if you're going to communicate with the chancellor, I got to show you one more thing. So she takes me to her office, and first thing I'm struck by is it's a large table with chairs. I said, what's going on in your office? She said, I told you I'm the lead teacher. I work with children throughout the day that my teachers are having trouble with. And then she starts to show me the portfolios of her students, and she has, for every single student, samples of their work. And then she shows me the computer printout, and then she can tell me exactly where every single child is and which interventions are being applied, because they understand that the key to changing outcomes for children is early, effective intervention. So now I'm really impressed, because everything is deliberate, everything is focused, nothing is left to chance. So I do write to the chancellor, Joel Klein. I say, you need to go visit PS 28. And to his credit, he's there within 2 days. And he goes to see the school, and he's also impressed. So he writes a memo that's sent out to all 1,700 principals in New York City and tells them, go visit PS 28 and look at their data system. That's the only thing he mentioned, the data system. Because New York City had just spent $100 million on that data system, and he was glad to see someone using it. So I write to him, I said, Joel, I'm so glad you visited the school, but you missed it. Because it's not just the data system that makes it possible for a school like that to get those kinds of results. They understand the broad view. Klein epitomizes the narrow view. And even when it's right in his face, he doesn't see it. You as educators and you as community members who understand education have to understand it's going to take a broader view if you want to see all children, particularly children like those at a school like PS 28, to achieve and to thrive and to succeed. And they succeed on the conventional measures. They don't give them different tests. They take the same tests everyone else has taken. But the school's not only focused on test preparation. It's focused on much more than that. And that's what we're seeing, is that when we focus on much more than that, when we stay focused on the right question, the wrong question is how to raise achievement. What's the right question? How to get kids excited about learning. Different question. Wrong question is how do we hold teachers accountable? The right question, how do we hold everyone accountable, including the politicians? Right? Wrong question. How to close the achievement gap. Right question, how do we create schools where a child's background does not determine what they can accomplish? People for education have to realize this issue is too important to leave it to our politicians to figure out. You have to continue to organize, support, to create the schools this country needs and deserves. Your future's at stake. I encourage you to do all you can to make the schools as good as they can be for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. We have a very short time for questions because nobody was warning Pedro. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. There's a microphone right there. We literally can probably have about 4 short questions, not speeches, just real direct questions.
Can you tell us briefly about the Coalition of Essential Schools in the U.S.?
Well, I'm actually on the board of the Coalition for Essential Schools, and unfortunately, the coalition is in a bit of disarray right now. And I would say it's in part because the coalition never figured out how to adjust to the new policy environment created by No Child Left Behind. And so schools that had once been part of the coalition started dropping off. And so sadly, the coalition is, I think, not in very good shape right now. So I would say the work of the coalition lives in schools, but the coalition as an organization is in trouble.
Just a really, really short question. Where do I get more information? Do you have a book or something out there that I could?
So I have a relatively new book called Creating the Opportunity to Learn. I did with Wade Boykin. You could get that, and then you could just look me up online. You can see a bunch of other recent publications.
How do you win over the politicians who have in trust our taxes to apply to the system?
So I would say focus less on the politicians, focus more on the people. If you win over the people, the politicians will follow. Right? Politicians are followers, not leaders in most cases. Right? and so that's the reason why the work you're doing, you really want to organize communities, organize parents to demand something different. The politicians will finally realize what we've been offering is not what people want. Right? So I would, because I have tried the other way, focusing on politicians, and it's extremely frustrating. And I'm actually, that's the reason why I think even the work in media is so important, to get the public's awareness that there's another way possible.
Do you foresee realistic change happening so that the existing educational structure in Canada and the United States becomes more than just a vehicle for reproducing the existing social order?
I think it's possible because, as I cited, there are examples where it's possible, but it's going to take a kind of grassroots, bottom-up strategy. And I think that's, the coalition was originally organized to do that, but we're going to need a new version of that. And that's what we're trying to do with this broader, bolder approach. A lot of the same people who were in the coalition are now with that one. And a more bottom-up strategy, and I'm seeing evidence of that. But I'm a pragmatist, and I know this is a long-term strategy, nothing that'll happen in the short term.
Thank you.
I have two short, quick questions. Number one, from my table, they wanted to know if you'd be interested in becoming an honorary Canadian and help our education system.
I'm honored to be invited.
And my question is that I'm a parent of 2 kids, and I'm really concerned of my kids' education. So I wanted to be involved with my kids' education. I became a school chair, and my daughters are very smart. They have all the potential to be a successful student. But the thing is, whenever you ask questions, you're afraid of being judged. So how can you take that away of the being judged and thinking that, oh, if you ask questions to the teachers, you're not judging them, you just want to improve your kids. Yeah. So how do you take that attention?
So I would say that it's very difficult when we engage schools individually, right? Because then it's just one parent in relation to the whole school. We need to organize parents collectively to engage the school staff about this partnership I alluded to. Because that's what we really need, is a partnership that's premised on trust, that's premised on good communication between families and schools. But we can't just treat it as your job as an individual parent, because there are other parents out there who have similar concerns but may not have the time or might be too intimidated to approach the school. So we need to see this more as a collective undertaking than simply an individual responsibility. Although obviously every individual family must do their part as well.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Annie.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pedro. Thank you.